Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Why Two Grown Men Won't Go Into the Woods by Three Frog. Back in 2023, me and my partner were both living at his mom's house. Most days we'd get home from work around 5 p.m., get dressed, and then we would go to these woods in the hills just outside the town we lived in. For context, these woods as a whole are 12 miles long and about 4 miles wide. There's breaks in the woods of farmland and fields, creating separate woods over these hills with different names. You can walk through these woods if you want. There's paths winding through most of the woods as trails, and if you want to walk over the span of the hills from one side to the other, you can if you really want to. Just most of it's through the woods and uphill if you're coming from the south. The one we always went to was called Wind Down Woods. So me and my partner would go to these woods nearly every day after we finished work, just to go for a walk or smoke or both. We went about doing our usual routine, walking around and talking about our days, following the trail in the woods that loops around a large set of trees with more of them around on the outside. It would kind of look like a messed up donut from a bird's eye view, I guess. We were walking on the path that took us back towards the top of the woods, point A, to the path that also takes you down towards the car park once you get to the meeting point of all the paths. That's when we saw this man in the distance walking down the path at point B. Point B was one of the trails that just goes up into the woods beyond Winddown. We still had to get to the meeting point of all the paths to get back to our car. At that point, he was pretty far away from us. But still, I had a bad feeling because the first thing I noticed about this man when we got closer was that he was wearing office shoes and carrying a pair of hiking boots while seemingly on a walk in the woods. We were talking about this as we were walking up and laughing about how strange it was. The guy was walking faster than us as he was going downhill and reached the meeting point of the paths a few minutes before we did, but we could see him the whole time. When he got to the meeting point of the paths, all he did was stand there. He didn't do anything. He just stood and was looking around. I had a really bad feeling at this point, as he didn't even look like he was lost. He just looked like he was waiting for something. My partner and I were pretty weirded out at this point, and we're thinking about turning around and heading back down into the woods and going back around the long way, just to get away from this guy's weird-ass vibes. And in the end, we decided that walking back down into the woods would ultimately look way too suspicious, as the man had definitely seen us walking up the path towards him the same time we'd seen him walking down. So we just kept walking up. The whole time, this guy was just still standing there, looking around with these shoes in his hands. Having no other choice than to walk past this guy to get to the path down to the car park, we went up and past him. Getting close to him, I saw something that worried me more than it weirded me out. The guy had a backpack on, and there was a handle coming out of it. 100% the handle of a hammer or an axe. I knew it couldn't have been anything else. He hadn't been on a phone at all the whole time we'd seen him, not even when he was just standing around. Just more and more stuff added up, and it was freaking us out. As we walked past him and started down the path towards the car park, the guy decided he now knew where he needed to go without getting a phone out or a compass, nothing, and he started walking down behind us. At this point, I was freaking out, and so was my partner, who doesn't usually get paranoid about stuff like this, because I do it all the time for no reason. But this guy was not right. There were no other cars in the car park but ours, so he had no reason to be walking there. We were walking as fast as we could without running away from this guy, and after what felt like a lifetime, we got in the car, locked the doors, and drove off. I didn't even look back. To this day, I think about that guy and how strange he was acting. But then again, I think about how strange we were probably acting, and maybe the poor guy was simply on a walk. Cut to just the other week, and me and my partner were at our friend's house for their birthday, just hanging out, meeting other friends we hadn't met before, and just having a blast. But as usual with every small group hangout, it got late and we started talking about weird experiences we'd had and spooky encounters. Obviously, we told everyone about our encounter with the really strange man in the woods. A couple of the girls at this hangout worked at a reserve called Fine Court. It's one of the woods in the hills I've been talking about. They seemed pretty rattled by the story we had told and said that they had one that would make it worse. We needed to hear it. One evening at work, one of them was on a closing shift with her manager, and they'd been cleaning up the cafe and doing final checks, when her manager told her that he was good doing the rest by himself and that she could just go home. I mean, who doesn't want to hear that? So off she went to her car. She sat there for a bit to chill and roll a cigarette before driving home. And later that night she got a text saying, "Don't ask, just don't come into work tomorrow." She found out that after she left work, her manager had finished cleaning up like he said and gone to his car to leave. Getting into his car, a man approached him from out of the woods and started wrestling with him, trying to steal his car keys. Managing to get the man off and get into his car, the manager drove away and called the police. After talking to them, they connected some dots of a call that they'd had earlier that evening from a concerned neighbor living in a village a couple of miles from Fine Court. It was a report of a suspected burglary at one of her neighbors. Another call came in from a mental health institute in a town about as far away as ours from those woods from the opposite direction, saying that one of their patients had escaped. Turns out, after the police put the whole story together, this man escaped, got a haircut, and then walked miles to this village in the middle of nowhere. He broke into a house he thought was abandoned, and it was actually the home of an elderly couple. The man was completely disabled and wheelchair-bound, and his carer was his wife. The man murdered the elderly lady and just left the man in the house before leaving and walking into the woods, wandering around them and looking for someone with a car he could steal. That's when he ended up at Fine Court and tried to take the woman's manager's car, then ran off into the woods again to find someone else. Me and my partner are so sure this is the same man we saw acting suspicious at Windown all that time ago, as their story was from the same month as ours, and the time frames matched up perfectly to when we would have seen him after he had tried to steal the manager's car and ran off back into the woods. The police caught him the next day, just wandering around in the woods up there. That guy was following us back down to our car. But who's going to jump two guys in an open space where one of us could have easily made it to the road? I think he was trying to freak us out and get us to go back into the woods when he stopped at that meeting point and was loitering around. I don't know. This still horrifies me to this day, and I just needed to get it off my chest and share this with someone. Ouija board experience my mom had by Dismal Manufacturer. This happened to my mother when she was in her teens. Her mom had just gotten the family a Ouija board for a present, and she had played with one as a child and thought it was interesting and fun. It was a Sunday evening when this took place. My mom's best friend came over to her house, and her older sister's friend was also there. The four of them were playing with the Ouija board at the dining room table, asking various questions. Who will I marry? What will my husband look like? What kind of job might I have? Etc. The answers became very erratic. One or more of them began to think that someone was trying to influence the board. All hands on the board were quiet and still, and one of them asked, "Who is really in control of this board?" My mom's hands were on the planchette when she felt a sharp jerk. The other people's hands were barely touching it. It spelled out Satan in very quick and deliberate motions. and then stopped. They began to argue, some saying she pushed it or she pushed it. Some of them said that nobody did. They all turned their heads towards the left from where my mom was sitting, arguing with one another, when suddenly, without feeling a puff of air or anything, the candle, which was on the right of everyone, went out. It scared them so badly. They all jumped up and ran to the porch of the church, which was across the street. It was late Sunday night after services, so the doors were locked and no one was there. But they stayed there and just talked a few minutes before walking back to the house. My mom hasn't touched a Ouija board since. Long Haunting by Neander Thunder. Both my parents were living in Canada when COVID happened. I was in high school and living with my paternal grandparents, mostly to take care of them. When COVID became big in April of 2020 and all the schools and colleges were closed, we moved away from the city to avoid the possibility of getting my grandparents infected. The house that we moved to was situated on a river island in the middle of the Padma River in Bangladesh. When I say that it was isolated, I mean it was isolated. The river island was shaped like a boomerang. Its northwest arm was about 4 miles long, around 30 feet above water level. That was the part we lived in. That portion had other inhabitants and a few trees. There was a village of about 50 people, at least 3 miles to the north. Everyone in that village had boats because the island would largely go underwater come monsoon season, so they lived on the boats while that happened. All the trees it had were small shrubbery, occasional bamboo groves, and exactly 5 tall palm trees. Most of that side of the island was covered in grass, at least as tall as I was at the time. The southern side of the island was maybe 2 miles long. It was newer and was mostly still exposed white sand. It had barely been there for a year, and nobody lived out there. The house we were moving into was an old tin shed house built on tall stilts. It was 1 story, and despite requiring significant renovation when we moved in, its layout was modern. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 to the south and sharing a long balcony, and 1 east with a large window. 1 of the south and 1 of the east each had attached bathrooms. They were connected to a common dining space that had a kitchen, a common bathroom, and a window to the north. The door and the patio were to the west, and all the doors were made of steel. I took the eastern room, and my grandparents settled in the southern room with the attached bathroom. When we moved in, we had people redo the paint job for us, and we bought a small generator for electricity. My grandfather had suffered a stroke in 2018 and had lost strength on the left side of his body. He could walk, take baths, and use the toilet himself, but he needed help getting dressed and someone to hold his hand when he was outdoors. My grandmother's feet would swell up painfully if she walked too much. That led us getting to a housekeeper because as soon as the schools opened, my high school graduation exams were supposed to start, and I needed to study and prepare for that. She was a young woman in her mid-20s. She was local, whose husband had left for the city and then stopped picking up her calls. She had no formal education beyond 5th grade and needed money to support herself. Whatever supernatural forces had been attached to this place seemed to target her. She faced the most violent and mentally degrading of the supernatural phenomenon that was about to happen in the house. She told me about it because we got along quite well, being closer in age, but she asked me to not tell anyone else about what was happening. I'll respect her wishes and only divulge the incidents that I myself experienced. The first incident actually happened when we first moved in. My grandparents were already asleep on their bed, and the housekeeper hadn't arrived yet. I was struggling to fall asleep in a new place, but around 1 a.m., I heard some noises coming from below. It sounded like someone was hitting the stilts underneath us with sticks. My first thought was that we had just brought a lot of new furniture and loads into the house, and this was just the house settling onto that new load. But the sound was regular, and it very clearly sounded like something being hit over and over again. I started to wonder if the structure was starting to collapse. So I took a flashlight and went outside to check on what was making the noise. But by the time I walked down the stairs, the sound stopped. And when I shone the flashlight under the house, there was nothing there. Afterwards, when our housekeeper arrived at the house in the middle of May, I was studying in my room when my grandparents had gone to sleep around 11 p.m. That's when I saw someone or something dark standing in the dining space. My first thought was that it was the new housekeeper. But then I noticed that this thing was almost as tall as the ceiling and as broad as a door. The housekeeper was 5'0" and very skinny. When I remembered this, I looked back at it, and I saw it moving fast towards the window, loudly tipping over a chair on its way. The window had bars, by the way, so it wouldn't be able to simply jump out. I ran into the dining room and turned on the light, but there was nothing there. The housekeeper had heard the noise and came out of her room to check, but I told her I had accidentally tipped over the chair so that I wouldn't scare her away on her first night. I still regret saying that to her. After that, things started happening around the house. Sometimes I'd see shadow people out of the corner of my eyes, and strange noises like people were coming from outside with words that I didn't understand. But every time when I checked, no one would be there. I'd hear my name being called from outside nearly every night, and something would touch me when I was studying or trying to sleep. Sometimes our generator would randomly shut down. That one I could probably chalk up to mechanical failure, but it was still odd. There wasn't anything being thrown around, but the presence seemed to do way more aggressive things to our housekeeper. She'd hear the voices provoking her with insults about her situation. Her food would get ants if she left it alone for even a few minutes, when the rest of the house didn't have an ant problem at all. Sometimes she'd feel as if something was piercing her skin, only to find spots on her skin hot and red as if she'd been scratching there when she hadn't been. That could have been insect bites, but in context, I'm inclined to believe they weren't. None of us got bit like that. One time, she got locked in her room from the outside, and after that, she didn't feel safe in her room at night, so she tried to spend time elsewhere around the house. She couldn't quit because apparently she had nowhere else to go. Nearly nothing happened with my grandparents. My grandma was quite pious, and she insisted that faith in Allah kept them safe and kept really bad things from happening. But that only seemed to be working for her and Grandpa. When monsoon season came in July, the river island flooded completely. Water rose up to the 5th step leading up to our house, and our house was completely surrounded on all sides by rushing water. My grandparents bought a motorboat for the commune, and I was the only one who used it because the housekeeper stayed home in case of an emergency. One evening, around 6 p.m., I was bringing groceries and petrol for the generator by the motorboat when some vegetables dropped from the boat. I leaned over to the water to pick it up, and I heard a splash and felt that something had climbed into the boat. I was going to turn and look, but I was hit with an intense feeling of just wrongness. I slowly turned my head, and in my periphery I saw that something black in coloration was sitting on the other end of the boat from me, in that case about 12 or so feet away. I kept my eyes down, avoiding eye contact with this thing, and just waited for it to vanish. But it didn't. I couldn't see it distinctly, but I had the distinct feeling that it was looking at me. After a while, I reached out and turned on the motor of the boat, hoping that the movement would shoo it away. It did not go away, but I managed to steer the boat to the house, all the while not looking at this thing. But then I heard another splash, and I assumed that this thing had jumped into the water. We were about 15 or so feet from the stairs of the house. When I got onto the stairs and looked back, there was nothing there. I dragged the motorboat in and took the groceries and petrol in too. That night, something banged on my window. That shouldn't have been possible because there was open water on all sides and the window was at least 6 feet above the water level. One night, around midnight in September of 2020, I found the housekeeper's room door open. I went in to chat, but she wasn't there. I looked around for her in the house, but found the front door open instead. When I went out, I found that there was a clear trail of flattened grass, as if something heavy like an elephant or buffalo went through there. There was no way that our tiny housekeeper flattened that much grass while moving. I followed the path anyway, and I came to the newer southern side of the river island, about 200 yards away from the house. There I found our housekeeper was walking off into the white sand, seemingly sleepwalking. I got over to her and shook her to wake her up. When she noticed me, she started crying and said that she would not go back to the house. But she had walked out in clothes that she had slept in. September in Bangladesh isn't conducive to sleeping with a lot of clothes on, especially in a tin shed house. For my modesty's sake, she went back, but she laid on the floor of my room that night, and then got up and went back to her own room before my grandparents woke up at dawn. That next day, she was doing her usual chores again, with no talk of leaving the house. Things got even worse for her after that. She did a lot of things to avoid being the victim of these forces, like bathing outside in the river instead of in the house, eating her meals as soon as she had done cooking them, etc. But things seemed to follow her, and as soon as night fell, they'd torment her, wherever she was, whichever room she went into. Bad things happened in that house. My grandma would constantly pray, and it seemed to work for her and Grandpa, as I mentioned, and it even quieted things down momentarily for me. But the prayers had no effect whatsoever on our housekeeper. At one point, I think our housekeeper wasn't here for shelter or money, but simply to spite what was ever in the house. In April of 2021, our housekeeper announced that she'd gotten in touch with her husband, so she took her things and left. Things became much less aggressive after that. I'd still see things from the corner of my eyes every now and then, and the occasional touch on the arm when I was sitting alone on the table. One time I heard something heavy loudly fall on the floor and dashed around thinking that one of my grandparents had fallen down, but nothing was amiss. We left that house 4 months after that, and I've never experienced paranormal things of that nature again. I mean, I have experienced unexplainable things, but they felt very, very different from whatever was in that house and what I felt there. I randomly saw the housekeeper again last year in November. We talked. Apparently the supernatural things never followed her around, but her life has been on a downward spiral since then. Shortly after she left our house, she found out that she could not bear children. I gave her some money before going on with my life. What do you guys think about this? That house has sat empty ever since my grandpa built it, so there's no history there. And as I mentioned, the land is also very new. Why would a spirit target a singular person so brutally like that? I don't have any answers. Do you? The Blue Truck That Followed Me by L.L. Morris. When I was in my mid-20s, I moved to a new apartment complex with my parents. We liked this place because it was within walking distance to a lot of things. There was a gym, restaurants, a grocery store, hair store, and a mini-mall a few blocks away. This was before my joints went to hell, So at the time I joined the gym and walked there faithfully as my warm-up multiple times a week. I usually went on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays late mornings, and returned after about 2 hours of workout. One Tuesday, I noticed a blue truck driving slowly on the street as I walked, but I didn't pay much attention to it until I saw the same truck that Thursday. The same truck showed up again that Friday on the lane closer to me, so I moved closer to people's yards as I walked hastily. The truck slowed down, keeping up with my pace briefly before driving off. I was nervous and decided to wait for my dad to get off of work so he could walk me back home. I skipped the gym that Saturday. I decided to change up my workout schedule since I didn't have a set workout schedule. I switched my gym days to Mondays and Wednesdays and walked there in peace for about a week until the blue truck showed up again. The driver had learned my new schedule and began following me again. That Wednesday, the truck slowed down and the driver rolled down his window. It was a man of Hispanic heritage, and he smiled at me and was beginning to talk, when another man leaving the gym and 2 women left their front porch and came up running and yelling. They said they had witnessed the man following me. They asked him what he was doing, why was he following me, and what did he want? And while they screamed at him, the man quickly drove away. They asked me if I was okay, and I told them that he had been following me and had learned my new schedule. The man walked me to the gym and told me to not leave by myself. They said I needed to be careful and to call the police the next time because people are crazy. I've always been grateful to strangers for stepping in that day. My dad walked me back home again that day, and I waited a month before going back to the gym. I just walked my dog around my apartment complex for exercise instead. Once I did start going back to the gym, I didn't see the blue truck again. The Day I Wanted to Forget by Maya. Maybe to some this isn't terrifying, but for me, it changed my life forever. It made me realize there's another side to our life that we don't fully understand, whether it's an afterlife or a different dimension, a place bad spirits go, or something or a force beyond our understanding. This is about a Ouija board. Of course, my mom always told me to never play with one, but I was a stupid teenager. It was nuts because we didn't actually have a board. My friend just knew how to draw one out, so we got a poster board and she drew it out. Then we made a makeshift heart thing. She explained how it all worked, so we sat around it, 3 of us, and we started playing. I automatically assumed one of my girlfriends was moving it around because it was moving around pretty smoothly and answering all of our questions clearly. I mean, that's what I always assumed when I heard about people playing. It wasn't until it said something really creepy to us that we kind of started getting mad at each other. We were asking the usual questions teenage girls would ask. Who would lose their virginity first? It told us who, what order, and at what ages and the names of the guys we would be with. Honestly, it was so descriptive it almost seemed real. But it was strange. The one girl who was religious and really controlled by her parents, the board said that she would lose her virginity first. At the time, it made no freaking sense. It said I would lose it last, and the other girl would be in the middle of us. Then we asked the board who would get married. It said who would get married, but it didn't say their partners' names. It did say who would get divorced and have kids and whatnot. It said that the one girl that was religious would never get married. The other girl would get married and divorced, and I would get married and never divorced. I guess all the answers and questions were just entertaining, but kind of starting to rub us the wrong way. No feelings were getting hurt, but it was weird. But that's when it started to get really weird. One of us asked if we would be friends forever. The whatever it was that was answering us spoke and said, no, that 2 of us would be friends, but they wouldn't be friends with me anymore. I remember getting upset. I looked up, not removing our hands, and we were all confused, discussing who was moving it. We all looked terrified, but we all swore to each other that none of us was moving it. At that point, we were all kind of pissed off about the things that were being said, because it was kind of offending every single one of us. But it was at that moment that I knew I wasn't moving it, and I knew they wouldn't lie about this. It was too weird. Everything was so detailed and strange, and it was almost insulting, saying the religious girl would be the one who had sex first, but never get married. It said that she would lose it in a car. I mean, why would she say that about herself? At that time, I was the only one that had a boyfriend, so me losing my virginity last seemed off. Everyone was kind of getting offended by the things that the board was saying. I mean, one of us wasn't getting married, one would get divorced, so as much as the answers would prop one of us up, it would also pull us down, too. We ended up asking it to say something that would prove itself was real, something that only it knew that we didn't. It said Bruce was cheating on his wife Kelly, and they'd get a divorce. Who the heck was Bruce and Kelly? But the board just kept repeating itself, so we kind of ignored it and moved on. As teachers, we really didn't give a shit about people getting divorced. What it said next, though, was really creepy and sent us into a tizzy, among all the other questions we had asked. After we figured out it wasn't us moving it, we looked back down at the board and we didn't say anything. But it just started to move, and it asked, did we want to know something? And we said, know what? And it asked, do you want to know when you're going to die? We got so freaked out, we just pulled our hands off immediately, which I know you're not supposed to do. But at that point, we were screaming and not thinking clearly. We got the attention of some of our other friends that were in a different section of the basement, and they came over and asked what the heck was going on. There were 2 other friends, and they were dating and doing God knows what, and it's why we had banished ourselves to that part of the basement to play this creepy-ass game. Her mom was upstairs, and it was the only way they could be alone together if we were all together, if you follow my meaning. We were using a candle because of this, and they were off doing stuff on the other side and wanted the lights dim. They were playing music, so they really didn't hear what we were doing and what was going on until we freaked out. We then explained to the couple what had happened. The guy wanted to play because he thought it was badass, and he literally had to talk us into it by taunting us, saying it was all fake. He said it wasn't real and that we were just making it up, and we said, no, it's real. It was almost like our egos had gotten the best of us, and we had forgotten how scared we were, because we wanted to prove that this thing was real and knew strange things. Anyway, we went back to playing, and her boyfriend played, but she didn't. She was too freaked out and went upstairs. Immediately, he said to the board, prove that you're real, do something. Now this should have been the sign that we stop. It said, get her to play. Get her to come back down. It went on to say, I need more energy to create something. So the boyfriend yelled, and she opened the door, and he persuaded her to come down, and he begged her to play. She finally relented, but the board just asked us to put our hands on the pointer and wait. I remember as the time had gone on, we finally said, how much longer? And it said, a few more minutes. It got to the point where our hands were falling asleep, and we had kind of forgotten, speaking amongst ourselves, that maybe we should just end it. But the boyfriend didn't want to. It had been about 10 minutes. We were still just chatting amongst each other about anything else, and that ended immediately when the boyfriend and the religious girl started screaming and pointed in the direction of where the candle was. They were facing it, so they saw it best. They got up, and the rest of us turned to look. I looked over, and what used to be a normal candle wasn't anymore. The flame was about 6 feet in the air, and it was blue. I mean, this thing was almost hitting the ceiling. We all screamed and ran up the stairs, and as we ran up, we could hear a low gurgling or groaning scream that felt as if it was beyond you. And it got louder and louder. All the hairs on my neck stood up. I'd never been so terrified. We ran out of the girls' front door and just stood on the front lawn screaming and crying. One of the girls peed herself. Another girl had a white streak in her hair permanently after this. I mean, it was one of the most stressful experiences any of us ever had as friends. The neighbors heard us and almost called the cops, but the girl of the house's mom came running out and was so confused, but calmed us down. I think the neighbors thought we were just watching a scary movie or something, and shortly after that, our parents all picked us up. We never really talked about it again, just about how scary it was. I mean, and honestly, it was almost too scary to talk about. Now for the creepiest part. Remember the part about Bruce and Kelly? Because we were in junior high, all the teachers were called by their last names. We found out that our teacher and his wife were getting a divorce because he no longer wore his ring. He had a tan line there, and someone asked if he had lost his wedding ring. He had mentioned his separation from his wife and quickly changed the subject. We later found out his ex's name was Kelly, and his name was Bruce. We were mortified. However, in time, things started to fade. My memories, the scary ones, feel more like a dream now. Even a week after it happened, it didn't feel real anymore. You think your mind is playing tricks on yourself, and that's how you get over it. That's how you're able to sleep at night. Those girls, years later, did stop being friends with me, just like the board had predicted. I remember getting a Facebook message from one of them in my mid-20s, and she asked me about things. If I had lost my virginity at the age the board said I would, and if the name of the guy was correct. She informed me that she and the other girl, the religious one, had lost theirs in the way the board had said they would, with the names of the guys. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I mean, we're talking years later, and I had almost forgotten. Trauma kind of does that to you. The board had said the correct age, but my guy's name was wrong. It predicted John, and that's not who I lost my virginity to. That felt good somehow. We left things there. I think it made us feel safe as adults that it was wrong, because it was all just coincidences, right? Maybe the thing with the candle wasn't real. I mean, we were just teenagers with creative imaginations, and maybe we just remembered things wrong. However, all of that came crashing down. I didn't realize my European boyfriend's name, if translated, was correct. His name Jan translates to John in English. Sit with that. Effing creepy. I never told the girl who messaged me on Facebook. I remembered the safe way we felt and didn't want to take that away from her. I'll never understand why it even matters, really. It's almost like it told us things that didn't affect our lives at all, although it did prove to us that there's something more to our existence. For years, I've struggled with sleep paralysis and nightmares that were very vivid. It wasn't until later when I became religious and started believing in God that things went away. Praying before bed, I got peace. When I was having paralysis or nightmares, the only thing that made them stop was when I would scream Jesus Christ, whether in my head or out loud. Being a religious person now, I'd never mess around with a spirit board. I don't think anyone should, to be honest. Sometimes I wonder if that's what prompted all my nightmares and all those creepy paralysis experiences I would go on to have. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or the podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you have a true scary Halloween or fall story, please send that in. We've still got time to fit you into the annual Halloween extravaganza coming up shortly. If you liked this episode, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below, let me know what you thought of the stories, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And of course, if you haven't already, why not become a subscriber and hit the notification bell for every time that I upload. Follow me on social media, there's links to that down below. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page, or check out some Campfire Crew and Uncle Josh merchandise at my TeePublic storefront. A link to that is down there as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.